Hi and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of On the Beaten Track. Like I said, this last couple of weeks have really been interesting. And when you are writing and reading through and making sure that you have enough context and content to be as impactful as possible, I haven't really gotten the balance right. Apart from last week's episode, which was quite uplifting for me. I hope it was for you. But the one previous to that was very hard. This one, as I was writing, editing, and putting it together, there's one thing that came to mind. And as I was looking for that silver lining or that moment of levity through what I'm going to take you guys through today, I think the thing that really struck me was that this is when the heroes that I knew assembled. It was kind of like Avengers Assemble. You guys know I'm always making movie references or something weird. But it was really the first time I start seeing these heroes that are very much in my mind or consciously that I've known start to emerge. And that made me super happy. It was my one silver lining. It is going to be heartbreaking to go through these acts over the next 3 episodes. I have decided that I wanted to look at 3 acts specifically in detail, but we'll start this episode off with the ones that were also being instituted and codified into law that would have had a massive impact on the communities. The 1940s were years of promise and betrayal. As the world fought fascism abroad, South Africa quietly perfected its own system of racial engineering at home. What began as scattered segregation laws in the 1920s hardened by the 1950s into the legal fortress known as apartheid. Today, we'll start unpacking some of the stories behind South Africa's most defining, devastating, and cruel apartheid laws. It's wrong to say that cruelty wasn't there before, because cruelty was the purpose of what we've seen before this and what we're going to see from now. But through it all, we hear the voices of those that refuse to be erased. As I said, for today's episode, I'll be looking at the Peking Act of 1943, Prohibition of Mixed Races of 1949, the Suppression of Communism Act, Bantu Education Act of 1953, and the Women's Rights and the Coloured Vote removed. I'll just be touching on that, and then I'll do a deep dive this week into the 1952 pass law. The next 2 episodes, I'll be doing the Population Registration Act, where we start to see the disruption of classification, and then the Group Areas Act. Let's get into the weeds of it. In 1943, pressure from white landowners, the government passed the Peking Act of 1943. Freezing property transactions between Indians and whites in Durban. Okay. On paper, it was a temporary measure. We're back again. Temporary measure. In reality, it formalized residential segregation. Local councils in Cape Town and Port Elizabeth began copying the model, quietly restricting coloured property ownership near white suburbs. Dr. Yusuf Dadu and G.M. Naicker, campaigns that would later merge into the Congress Alliance. In the Western Cape, Sissigul warned City Council, if they peg one race today, they will peg us all tomorrow. The Peking Act became the legal test case for the full-blown Group Areas Act 7 years later. In 1949, South African Parliament passed one of the first pillars of apartheid legislation, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, a law that didn't protect families, but rather tore them apart. This made it illegal for people classified as white to marry anyone of any racial group. Remember, it was first Africans bleeding into color. Now it's like only white is right. Heard that statement. Love, partnerships, and marriages, once private matters of the heart, became crimes against the state. This act was followed a year later by the Immorality Amendment Act, which extended the ban to include sexual relation across racial lines. The government claimed it was to preserve racial purity. I love how you all try to get this. Very few succeed. Racial purity. Yeah. Concepts, eh? In truth, it was a tool to reinforce segregation, control bodies, and erase the existence of mixed communities that had flourished in South Africa for centuries. For many families, this law meant heartbreak. Couples were forced to separate. Some fled the country to be together. Others lived in hiding, pretending to be strangers in public. Children of these unions were caught in a cruel limbo, their very existence defying apartheid's racial order. Fatima Meer said, "They told me my marriage was illegal. They told me my children did not belong anywhere." Churches, international observers, and members of the anti-apartheid movement condemned the law as morally indefensible. Yet the regime held firm. Police raided homes. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspect couples. The state's obsession with racial boundaries became a weapon of fear, not just against love, but against unity. The act remained in force for over 30 years until it was finally repealed in 1985. By then, the damage was deep. Families broken, communities divided, generations scarred by the idea that love had a color code. My marriage right now would be illegal. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriage Act reminds us that apartheid didn't just separate people in law, it tried to separate their hearts from each other. And yet across time, love proved more endearing than hate. For every broken family, there were others who defied, who loved in secret, and who refused to let the state define their humanity. Okay. That one hit a bit too close to home for me. In 1950, along with the Group Areas Act, the state outlawed nearly every progressive voice under the Suppression of Communism Act. This meant political parties, labor unions, and community newspapers that united colored, Indian, and African workers were crushed. Ray Alexander Simons, who I spoke about last week, was banned from public meetings. James Laguma was imprisoned for organizing strike. Yet from underground networks, these activists helped form the Congress Alliance, which would produce the Freedom Charter 5 years later. Education then became the new battlefield. The Bantu Education Act, cruel. The Bantu Education Act created a separate, inferior system for African children, but it rippled into colored schools too. Funding was slashed, teachers segregated, and syllabuses rewritten to emphasize obedience over ambition, indoctrination. This further limited access to higher education, fueling a cycle of underemployment. Teachers like Dr. Neville Alexander, Ray's later protege, and Peter Clark began community study circles that would keep intellectual resistance alive. Imagine. In 1956, 20,000 women marched on Pretoria to protest the past laws. Josie Mpama, Ray Alexander, and Sissy Gould's legacy pulsed through every step. Yet while women marched, movement erased the final political voice of the colored people. The Separation Representation of Voters Amendment Act removed coloured voters from the common roll. It marked the death of the Cape's multiracial democracy, a right that had existed since the 1850s. The Torch Commando, led by war hero Adolf. Yes. When I first read it, I was like, bad newsletter? Bad person? Bad news bear? No. Adolf Sailor Marlin united white liberals and colored activists in mass torchlight marches. The Torch Commando was not a political party, but a mass protest movement. Its main goals were to defend the Constitution and the rule of law, protect voting rights for colored South Africans, oppose racial discrimination and authoritarian government, promote unity among all South Africans who believed in democracy. It was deeply tied to liberal, anti-fascist and pro-democracy ideals that many ex-servicemen brought home from fighting against Nazism. So it was just a natural thing for them to do. The movement was named for its dramatic torchlight marches. Thousands of men and women paraded at night holding burning torches, symbolizing the flame of freedom. The first rally took place in Cape Town in 1951 and drew around 10,000 people. Similar rallies took place in Johannesburg, Durban, Port Elizabeth, Bloemfontein, and other smaller towns. At its peak, the movement claimed over 250,000 members, making it one of the largest mass protest movements in South African history at the time. Amazing. The sight of an ex-serviceman in uniform carrying torches became a powerful symbol of resistance against apartheid's early laws. The Suppression of Communism Act was used to intimidate members. By 1953, sustained pressure, surveillance, and fear of reprisals, membership declined rapidly. Fear. The movement effectively dissolved by the mid-1950s, though its ideals lived on in later liberal and anti-apartheid activism. The Separation Representation of Voters Amendment Act, through its disenfranchisement, radicalized a generation. By 1959, Pan-Africanist Congress movement were born, setting the stage for open rebellion. By 1952, apartheid was underway. The National Party had won in 1948, passed a raft of segregationist legislation, among them the Natives Act of 1952, which says the abolition of passes and coordination of documents, often called simply the Pass Laws Act. This law, just remember, there was a pass law before. Remember, and we spoke about it, I can't even remember which episode. We spoke about the Dompas. We spoke about people not being able to move, whether they were slaves, whether they were this, they needed these documents, right? So what this law did was it consolidated the existing permits and passes requirement, which was set by each province, essentially, and created a single national system. So rather than have these different documents or passes for different provinces or tasks, a reference book or a pass book, or colloquially the Dompas, was introduced. Black South Africans over the age of 16 were required to carry this book at all times. I can't even carry my wallet with me. Goodness gracious. So what did this reference book have in it? It included your name, a photograph, fingerprints, employment record, place of residence, tax payments, sometimes the number of times you had violated the pass law. If one was moving to a white area, one needed specific permission, endorsement or permits recorded in the book. So it's like your ID book that we had. So it had all this information in it. But why did they do this? Cruelty and control is always the purpose. They wanted to control the black labor supply. The economy relied heavily on migrant and urban black labor. But the apartheid government wanted to tightly regulate who could enter, reside, and work in urban white areas. They wanted to enforce segregation. Spatially, where people could live and move, socially, which functions and spaces they could access, and economically. The past laws were part of a legal system to restrict freedom of movement and maintain white supremacy. They wanted to bureaucratize oppression by making every Black person always liable to arrest for technical non-compliance, and I'm sure these guys use their discretion, right, to apply these non-compliance. The reference book system tightened the net of surveillance. Also, the law was part of influx control, controlling the number of Black people in urban areas, often under the excuse that cities were overcrowded or that there wasn't enough housing or services. But in practice, it was about power and racial control. I think we can all agree with that. Though the laws were aimed at Black South Africans, the past law system affected colored people as well, though in somewhat different ways and at different intensities. Let's be clear. Our Black brothers and sisters were the main focus of the cruelty. It didn't mean that we weren't also being subjected to this. It's just because they were the majority of the population and they really wanted to control the majority. So the intensity was high where the population was big. For Black South Africans, they had severe restrictions on entering white or urban areas without valid endorsement. Many were migrant workers, which they were forced into by the government. They had to carry passes while going to work, returning home for short periods, or visiting families. Without the pass book, they would be subjected to arrest, fines, and deportation back to reserves or rural homelands. Colored South Africans sometimes have slightly more lenient permit regimes in certain provinces. They also faced restrictions. In many areas, particularly under the Group Areas Act, residential lines were drawn. Colored people required passes or permits to work or live in white areas. Though some pass laws were eased or modified for coloreds, many were still subject to police checks and penalties if documentation wasn't in order. On women initially, the pass laws targeted men only, because only men can work. Okay, great. But 1952 Act laid the foundation to make women also carry reference books. Daily life became heavily regulated, where one could live, how long one could be there or stay in a city, whether one could visit someone or travel freely, whether one was legally employable. Many people were arrested for loitering, being in the wrong place without their pass, sleeping somewhere other than where the pass book said they resided, where their residence was. Even a small deviation, like I was with my friend, I stayed over there. I'm in this township, she's in that township. That was punishable. Not like I was in the white area, right? Because you're supposed to be in your... This says here where you're residing. So this is where you must... Imagine moving and having to change. To understand the law's cruelty, we turn to voices of those who lived under it. From Bantu, Juliet Bokala. We did not want to take these passes, but we were forced to take the passes. Everyone got a book like this, a pass. Alina Motleling. All Black people were expected to carry the identity document called Dompas. This pass book contained pages with information in our group, tribe, marital status, our address, employees, Robukanana Ketela, house number, where you stay. If they catch you sleeping at the next door, it's trouble. If you didn't sleep in the house number listed in your pass, you could be fined. These stories show how minute, everyday things, bedrooms, neighbors, routes to work, became potential grounds for arrest. If a person failed to carry a valid pass, police could arrest them. Fines, imprisonments, and forced removal to rural areas were common. Employees could be liable. Someone's pass permits could be cancelled if behavior or documentation requirements weren't satisfied. make legal employment and residence invalid. Women once required to carry passes face particular risks, for instance, going to the market, churches, or hospitals, or just moving around town. The anguish of having to show the passbook, the humiliation, and then the fear. The Defiance campaign of 1952 was South Africa's first large-scale, non-violent resistance to apartheid. Organized by the African National Congress and the South African Indian Congress, it arose in response to oppression laws like the Pass Laws Act, Group Areas Act, and the Suppression of Communism Act, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Yusuf Kachalia. Volunteers deliberately broke apartheid laws, entering white-only areas, refusing to carry passes, and violating curfews, to expose the injustice of racial segregation. Over 8,000 protesters were arrested, including women like Lillian Ngoyi and Florence Motomela, whose courage laid the foundation for later women-led movements. Though the government cracked down harshly, using arrests, violence, and censorship, the campaign united Africans, Indians, and colored South Africans in unprecedented solidarity. The Defiance campaign transformed the ANC from a small elite organization into a mass liberation movement, increasing its membership to over 100,000 by year's end. It ignited future struggles such as the Freedom Charter of 1955 and the Women's March of 1956, proving that peaceful, organized defiance could confront apartheid's brutality and awake the moral consciousness of the nation and the world. Beyond the arrests and fines, the pass laws inflicted deep psychological wound, constant fear and anxiety, the awareness that at any moment a police officer might demand your passbook, that a minor technicality, your house number, employer record, or even location could lead to your arrest. This induced anxiety and restricted spontaneous movement, humiliation and loss of dignity. Being stopped by the police, searched, and having to produce documentation just to walk or visit a neighbor was deeply demeaning. It reinforced one's status as other or subordinate. Arrests meant parents or spouses could suddenly vanish. Children could be left without support. Also, because employment was tied to the pass, losing it could mean the loss of livelihood. How many of you have lost a document or a card or something? The passbook forced people to constantly prove their right to exist in places that for centuries had been their homes or where their families lived. Over time, this created internalized stigma. People began to see themselves as always under surveillance, always contingent. Many told of anger and shame, but also determination. These psychological stresses contributed to collective resistance movements. Because the laws denied fundamental dignity, people resisted not just for legal rights, but for psychological liberation. They were formally abolished in 1986 with the Identification Act number 72 of 1986. What does that mean? I don't know. Their long-term strategy included spatial inequality, township, segregated urban planning, forced removals, all grew with pass laws. The locations where people were allowed or not allowed to live continue to shape cities today, influencing transport, work access, infrastructure, schooling, etc., etc. They wanted economic inequality. Because people could only live in certain places, they needed endorsements and work permits. Many were limited in job opportunities. The loss of work or inability to reach jobs contributed to poverty that passed across generations. Many families still carry stories of raids, arrests, harassment. The psychological scars, fear, mistrust of authorities, internal conflict about identity didn't disappear when they repelled the law. I can confirm. Today, issues of identity documents, policing, who gets to move now or where, still resonate. Legacy infrastructure, inequality, in-service delivery, informal housing in outskirts, all connect back to this history. Don't forget where it started. The past laws of 1952 were more than just laws on paper. They were instruments of daily oppression. They regulated bodies, controlled movements, shattered families, and inflicted psychological pain. And yet, through stories of resistance, large and small, people reclaimed dignity. But that doesn't mean that it was possible for everybody. When you are angry and you cannot, this now does not justify any kind of violence, but you take it out on those around. When I cannot be hitting the guy that is checking my past and making me feel inferior, I go home angry and I take it out on something or someone. When you walk through townships and informal settlements today, when you see how cities are divided or how people still struggle with documentation or movement, remember, laws like the past law leaves marks long after they've been repealed. It is so hard when you have mistrusted for so long to just go, oh, just get over it. We're now past it now. Shoo. We see now that between 1939 and 1959, we're still going to look at 2 more laws. But the blueprint of apartheid was inked into every part of life, from the house you lived in to the book your child could read. For South African colored communities, these laws meant exile in place, a people pushed to the margins yet central to the labor and culture of this nation. But even in exile, they built music, politics, resistance, identity. As Sissy Gould once said, they can move our houses, but they will not move our hope. Thank you for joining. In the next episode, I'll be looking at the Population Act and its impacts. And that's directly correlated to classification and how it was used, or it was, first of all, used to rip families apart, used as a means of safety, used as a means to get something more than you would have if you were classified as something else, really did tear people apart. Until then, may these stories remind us that freedom is not built just with laws, but with courage. And these people, they came and they fought, and eventually they won. So we can stand today. Thank you so much. Please keep subscribing and keep listening and interacting on the socials and in the episode and platform where you are watching. Thank you so much. Bye.